The Shadow of the Narcissistic Self: How to Discern and Diffuse the Early Warning Signs of Moralized Manipulation by Seth Cherpak. Introduction. When a relationship rewrites reality. The most dangerous manipulations do not begin by lying to you. They begin by teaching you to distrust what your soul already knows.
There are relationships that hurt you. Then there are relationships that do something stranger. They do not only wound your heart, they begin tampering with the felt meaning of things. They get between you and your own perception. They make what is warm feel suspect, what is innocent feel questionable, what is human feel indeedable, and what is most precious in you feel as though it is slowly perishing under a light that keeps calling itself truth. This book is about that kind of bond, not merely the bond that disappoints you, not merely the bond that breaks your trust, not merely the bond that leaves you with grief, the bond that rewrites reality. If you have lived inside one, you know how difficult it is to explain to people who have not. You try to describe it and end up sounding vague, dramatic, or strangely self-contradictory. You say things like, "It felt deep, but I kept leaving conversations confused," or "It felt morally serious, but somehow I always ended up smaller," or "I knew something was wrong, but every time I tried to name it, the naming itself seemed to get turned against me." That is part of the injury. Some forms of manipulation are easy to identify because they begin with obvious lies, obvious coercion, obvious threat. But there is another kind that works more quietly. It does not first conquer you through force. It destabilizes your footing. It bends the room. It introduces moral weather. It makes your own innocence feel less self-evident. It teaches you, often without saying so directly, that the burden of proof somehow belongs to you now. That is why people stay confused for so long. The first job of this kind of person is not to deceive you. It is to disorient you, and disorientation is difficult to defend against because it does not always feel like danger at first. Often it enters through things you would normally trust. Attraction, beauty, tenderness, rarity, chemistry, intensity, insight, shared language, the feeling of being seen, the feeling of finally, the feeling that something uncommon is happening here. That is why this book must begin with recognition before explanation. Because if you have lived this, you do not first need a theory. You need language for the atmosphere. You need someone to name the kind of room you were in. You need to feel that what happened to you was real even when it kept refusing to hold still long enough to be neatly described. And you need to understand something else. If you got pulled in, that does not mean you were stupid. It does not mean you were shallow. It does not mean the other person was right about you. In many cases, it means something more painful and more dignified at the same time. Some of your best qualities were used against you. Your loyalty, your patience, your willingness to look deeper, your ability to see gold buried under shadow, your refusal to reduce a person to their worst moment, your instinct to love what is not yet fully formed, your capacity to stay when a lesser person would have fled. All of that can be beautiful. It can also become the doorway through which a counterfeit bond enters. This introduction is not here to unpack the whole mechanism. That comes later. Here the burden is simpler and more human. I want you to recognize the kind of bond this is, the kind of person who creates it, and the kind of confusion it leaves behind. Because once you can recognize the atmosphere, the rest of the book will be able to name the architecture without losing your lived experience in abstraction. New subheader: the gentle hook that pulls you in. It rarely begins with something that looks like manipulation. It begins with a pull. Sometimes the pull is beauty. Sometimes it is depth. Sometimes it is pain. Sometimes it is intelligence, intensity, mystery, spiritual seriousness, sexual charge, or the uncanny feeling that this person matters before you yet know why. Sometimes it is the sense that they see something in you that other people have missed. Sometimes it is that they seem rare in exactly the way you have always longed for. And rarity is powerful. A bond that feels ordinary can be evaluated with ordinary caution. A bond that feels rare tends to bypass caution and enter the imagination. This is where limerence does its work. Limerence is not just attraction with more voltage. It is attraction baptized into significance. It gives chemistry the flavor of destiny. It makes instability feel meaningful, inconsistency feel mysterious, contradiction feel layered, and emotional intensity feel like proof that something profound is happening here. You do not merely feel interested, you feel chosen. You do not merely feel excited, you feel summoned. And that changes the standard of interpretation. When something feels rare enough, people begin granting it meanings they would never grant a calmer bond. Red flags become complexity. Contradictions become depth. Volatility becomes passion. Fragmentation becomes mystery. Instability becomes proof that you are dealing with someone unusually real, unusually wounded, unusually gifted, unusually alive. You do not think, this is dangerous. You think, this is different. That distinction matters. Because the hook is often not crude, it is gentle. It enters through what is best in you. If you are the kind of person who cares about essence, you are vulnerable to anyone who appears to carry hidden essence. If you are the kind of person who values truth, you are vulnerable to anyone who speaks in the tones of truth before they actually live inside it. If you are the kind of person who wants real love, you are vulnerable to a counterfeit that borrows the emotional music of real love while slowly replacing its substance with something darker. The counterfeit does not need to be fully formed at the beginning. It only needs to be compelling enough to gain entry. And sometimes the thing that gains entry is not even the person as they really are. It is the sense of who they could be, the gold in the dark, the hidden kingdom under the rubble, the beautiful thing trapped inside what already feels fractured. That is why some people do not just fall in love with a person. They fall in love with a possibility. And possibility can be one of the most intoxicating hooks there is, especially for a person with a redemptive instinct, especially for someone who does not want to abandon what is wounded, especially for someone who mistakes depth for destiny, especially for someone who believes love, patience, steadiness, and moral seriousness can call forth what is highest in another person. That hope is not stupid. It is often noble. But nobility can be weaponized when it meets a bond that does not run on mutuality. The relationship can begin to feel less like ordinary romance and more like initiation, less like getting to know another person and more like entering a field of significance, less like simple attraction and more like being caught in an atmosphere. And because the atmosphere is beautiful at first, you do not yet realize it is also building the conditions under which you will later begin doubting yourself. That is the gentle hook. It does not drag you. It draws you, and by the time you start asking what it is drawing you into, the bond may already be shaping your inner world more than you realize. New subheader: when what's precious starts to perish. The next stage is harder to explain because nothing obvious may have happened yet. No huge betrayal, no dramatic confession, no unmistakable cruelty. And yet something begins to perish. Not all at once. Quietly, the aliveness starts changing texture. What once felt warm now carries edge. What once felt open now carries subtle threat. What once felt nourishing now leaves a residue. What once felt like recognition now leaves you vaguely ashamed, vaguely guilty, vaguely smaller, vaguely unsure why. That vaguely is important because the injury often arrives before the explanation. You notice that certain conversations leave you less settled than they should. You notice that moments that sound morally serious somehow do not leave you morally strengthened. You notice that you start replaying interactions, not because you are trying to understand an ordinary disagreement, but because something in you is trying to locate the hidden turn where warmth became exposure. And the more precious the bond seemed at the beginning, the harder this stage can be to trust. Because who wants to believe that something beautiful is beginning to curdle? Who wants to admit that what felt rare may also be dangerous? Who wants to suspect contamination in something that still carries so much charge, so much hope, so much symbolic weight? So the mind hesitates. It gives the bond the benefit of the doubt. It explains away the dissonance. It tells itself this is just depth, intensity, misunderstanding, timing, conflict, stress, wounds, nervous system friction, or the cost of loving someone complicated. Sometimes those explanations are fair. Sometimes they are the first layer of self-betrayal. Because there is a point at which complexity becomes cover, a point at which depth becomes camouflage, a point at which "this is just hard" becomes the sentence a person repeats while something sacred in them is beginning to die. That is what this section has to name. When what is precious starts to perish, the soul often registers it before the mind consents to it. You do not yet say, "I am in a manipulative relationship." You say things like, "I don't know why, but I feel heavier. I keep trying to get back to how it felt in the beginning. I feel like I am always one conversation away from being restored and one conversation away from being accused. I feel like something tender in me is no longer safe here." That last line matters, because one of the deepest harms in this kind of bond is not simply that you get hurt. It is that what is most tender in you begins to feel dangerous to possess. Your warmth, your innocence, your desire to trust, your desire to love, your instinct to assume good faith, your ordinary humanity. All of it begins to feel increasingly exposed. This is where the anti-incarnational spirit of the whole dynamic begins to show itself, even if you do not yet have that language. Organic life is messy. Human beings are unfinished. Real love involves ambiguity, misattunement, embodiment, need, repair, limitation, contradiction, and context. A narcissistically organized psyche cannot bear that for long without trying to moralize it, clean it up, curate it, dominate it, or exile it. So what is human starts getting treated as suspect. What is ordinary starts getting moralized. What is soft starts getting measured. What is alive starts getting reviewed. And because the process is gradual, you still may not call it what it is. You only know that something precious in you is starting to perish in the presence of someone you still feel deeply drawn to. That paradox is part of the trap. New subheader: Why it hurts in ways you cannot name. By the time a bond like this has fully entered your nervous system, the pain is no longer simple. It is not just sadness. It is not just heartbreak. It is not just disappointment. It is grief mixed with confusion, shame mixed with longing, guilt mixed with anger, resentment mixed with tenderness, relief mixed with craving, the ache of wanting distance mixed with the ache of still feeling hooked. That mixture is one reason the pain can feel so hard to name. Ordinary heartbreak hurts, but it usually leaves reality intact. You know what happened even if you do not like what happened. You know what was lost even if the loss devastates you. But a relationship that rewrites reality wounds at multiple levels at once. It hurts emotionally because there was attachment. It hurts morally because you were not merely disappointed but disoriented. It hurts spiritually because what spoke in the tones of truth may have slowly turned truth against you. It hurts existentially because your very sense of who you were inside the bond may now feel unstable. That is why many people come out of these relationships not only asking, why did this happen, but what happened to me? You may find yourself carrying guilt that feels larger than the facts. Shame that feels attached not just to what you did, but to what you are. Resentment that keeps returning because some part of you knows you were put inside a no-win frame. Grief that is not only about the person, but about the version of yourself that was trying to emerge there and never got to fully live. That is not a small injury. It is the kind of injury that can follow you forward, into your next attraction, into your next hope, into your next attempt to trust. A new possibility appears, and instead of clean openness, something old wakes up. The psyche flashes forward to future loss, future accusation, future betrayal, future contamination. Not because the new person has earned that projection, but because the previous wound altered the image field. Love becomes pre-poisoned by remembered endings. And if you do not understand the architecture of the original bond, you may mistake that reaction for intuition. You may call memory prophecy. You may think you are discerning the new person when you are actually reliving the old wound. That is why this book exists. Not to flatter your pain, not to turn everything into pathology, not to reduce all conflict to narcissism, not to teach cynicism, but to restore reality contact, to separate signal from spell, to distinguish discernment from disgust, correction from care, accountability from control, intuition from insecurity, perception from projection, and also to restore something else that may have quietly eroded while you were trying to survive a bond like this, the right to trust what your soul already knew before someone else's atmosphere taught you to argue with it. If you have been through something like this, you do not only need healing, you need reorientation. You need to understand how the bond worked, how the masks worked, how the courtroom got built, how reality started bending, how the accusation outlived the evidence, how the grief spread forward, how your own best qualities may have been used to keep you in something long after truth was asking you to leave. That is where we are going. First, though, we have to understand the enchantment. Because if you do not understand why the bond felt like destiny in the beginning, you will not fully understand why it became so hard to leave once it started rewriting everything inside you.
End of the introduction of The Shadow of the Narcissistic Self by Seth Cherpak.